So thank you for joining me, Akira, to talk about school closures and equity. And I wanted actually to start before we launched into the meet to actually have you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying this topic.
Sure. So I started off researching tenant organizing and public housing in the city of Atlanta. And so Atlanta was sort of the first city to have public housing with tech-lit homes and the first city to tear virtually all of it down. And I was interested in learning about like working class and Black women-led politics within the context of tenant associations in the city. Following the demolition of public housing, I was really sort of looking still for how they were organizing and engaging in a political capacity around issues that mattered to them, particularly in their communities. And due to the absence of public housing physical developments and the introduction of mixed income or Hope 6 developments, there weren't tenant associations in those new developments for public housing residents, at least. And so again, predominantly Black women started organizing and meeting in public schools, particularly these regional clusters that they have. And it was really mimicking a lot of what I saw in public housing, of these shared geographies or communities that had shared issues and problems that were largely due to an absence of public goods and services in their communities. So they use the physical space of the public school to engage and make those grievances heard to the state. So I started looking at public schools as sort of infrastructure, whether it's like physical infrastructure or social infrastructure in Philadelphia. And this sort of, we had this sort of earlier experience in Philadelphia in 2013 where about 30 schools were closed. And just seeing from a city planning perspective what changes to the neighborhood and the community and the built environment followed after those closures and how to sort of incorporate those lessons into future school facility planning processes.
Great. I love that connection that you made in Atlanta about where the organizing went and how it persisted when the availability of the housing changed. So
Mhm.
crucial. So let's pull back a little bit and set some stage for this idea of schools as infrastructure and talk about in what ways do neighborhoods affect schools and in what ways do the schools affect their neighborhoods, just as a general thing.
Yeah, so that relationship has always really existed, I think, in ways that are not picked up and lifted up in the research, in particular in housing research. We all know when we look at home prices that the quality of the neighborhood school is a driver of that. And so I really wanted to better understand not just how the quality of the school could impact the home prices, but what other sort of amenities and services did public schools provide? And similarly, of course, when the quality of the school is perceived as bad, then that also translates into lower home values. And so this impacts at a broader scale the kind of stabilization of the neighborhood when you have these low prices, these low property values. Not only are you sort of generating lower property tax revenues, which sort of reify the declining quality of the school, but also you risk, depopulation and neighborhood destabilization. And so when thinking about the role of schools, a good school is an open school and a school that people want to be at. So it's much more than just test scores and grades and attendance, but also these sort of broader services and spaces that schools serve as. So, in thinking about the example in Atlanta, how these schools are serving as a political space, but more importantly, how schools allow people to interact with the state, whether it's through PTA or school board meetings. These are ways for people to sort of make their voices heard um, in a much more responsive process than voting, for example.
Right. And do you think that the advent in a lot of places of more school choice, the sort of decoupling of necessarily going to a neighborhood school when you live in a neighborhood has affected that, and has it affected it differently for different people?
Definitely. Obviously, you see the neighborhood school in particular is closely tied to like primary education. So our K to 8 schools, we want them to be, walkable or accessible for youth in particular. And then of course you see like greater dispersion with high schools that are typically kind of scattered throughout the city. But in thinking about the role of the neighborhood school and school choice, we're seeing something that's much more comparable, I think, to the housing struggle. So I've written about this in the past with my colleague Rand Quinn about the sort of parallel pathways of schools and housing in the country. This shift, particularly following integration or desegregation with Brown v. Board, in 1954, we're seeing this sort of demonization of public schools in the same way that we saw the demonization of public housing. And so, in that demonization, you lose your sort of political viability and popularity, and you start to see that defunding coming from federal, state, and eventually local levels. The introduction of choice, I talk about this in my book in Atlanta, is lifted up, honestly, by tenants and users of schools. I've watched video in the past of tenant leaders in Atlanta, older Black women who are speaking at the Heritage Foundation, for example, about the importance of school vouchers. And I trace that to when you're engaging in this sort of organized abandonment of public goods and services in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Of course, they want choice, right? They've not been afforded a functioning, robust welfare state. And as a result, they want to engage in the private market using public subsidy as a way to sort of, grasp on to citizenship and the full suite of rights in the United States.
But then that has ripple effects on the neighborhoods and the communities.
It has ripple effects, and it actually, I spoke earlier about the role of the public school as allowing you to engage with the state. And so when you have this privatization of public schools, again, still using public money, but is overseen by a corporation or nonprofit, it makes it much harder to engage in broader issues around distribution and equity of public goods and services. You become a consumer or a client, engaging with a service provider in a very sort of different way that has, what I think are more substantial ripple effects on democracy and political engagement,
A consumer rather than a citizen.
for sure.
Yeah. So you just said earlier a good school is an open school, right? So let's look at a neighborhood and talk about what can happen when a school closes. I know you have some examples of some different ways that it happened in Philadelphia in the 2013 closures.
Yeah, so the 2013 closures were initiated through a kind of private process. It could be framed as a planning process, but there was no sort of community engagement or even kind of a broad awareness that this was happening. The school district of Philadelphia engaged Boston Consulting Group to write a paper or a report on school facilities in the city. And this looked at very sort of technical data, such as the what we call Facilities Conditions Index or FCI, which analyzes the systems of a school, plumbing, roof, electricity, etc. Estimates the condition of them and then estimates the cost to get it into good condition. And so if the cost of the repair is higher than its replacement, usually you're going to remove that system. And if enough systems need to be removed, then that translates into the closure of the school. Another sort of data point that they used was this idea of utilization. So Philadelphia is a very old city. We had different periods of school construction beginning in the 1890s. Massive school construction at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, and mid-century. As the city is growing, it reaches its peak of about 2 million residents in 1950. So we had schools, high schools in particular, that were constructed for 2,000 and 3,000 students that by the time this planning process is happening are serving literally like 200 students. And so you're maintaining and operating these large structures for a very, very small population. So in addition to closures, a lot of the recommendations in the Boston Consulting Group report was consolidation. So all told, there were about 250 schools and about 60 schools were impacted in this report for closure or consolidation. In the end, you see some organizing after these, closures and consolidations are announced. The board at the time was a state-run board. The school district's local control had been sort of taken away by the state in 2001. We have, instead of our Board of Education, we have a School Reform Commission, SRC, that came in and was overseeing this facilities planning process with BCG. And so at that point, people are organizing to counteract these closures and consolidations. And we see some schools are saved, but are still what I consider to be vulnerable in future processes, and others are closed or consolidated. During this time, we saw the elimination essentially of middle schools in our city. Our schools went from K to 4 and 5 to 8 to K to 8s, often without consideration of the different spatial needs and social needs of those two age groups. And so this also caused some destabilization. One of the areas that was hardest hit was an area that's on the border of one of our more affluent suburbs, the western part of our city, an area known as Overbrook, borders Montgomery County, which is a very affluent county. Um, Residents and organizers have actually done a school funding walk where they walk from Gompers Elementary and Philadelphia over to Lower Merion School. And in that sort of 1 mile walk, there is a disparity of basically like 100% and additional funding for the suburban school student versus the one in Philadelphia. So that particular area saw a great deal of school closures, and populations have sort of continued to decline in those areas. North Philadelphia was also an area that was hard hit. And within a few years, you see the rise of school choice in these neighborhoods. And so a great deal of charters sort of reappear in the wake of these closed schools. And I can talk a bit more about sort of what happened to those physical spaces um, later on.
Great, thank you. And I think I recall you telling me at one point that the some of the different neighborhoods had different effects on the housing market when their schools closed. Some of them really deteriorating, some of them actually seeing some gentrification in an odd way. Can you talk about kind of those different kinds of things that might happen based on context?
Sure. It's funny, I'm at home right now. And I live right across the street from a school that is closed. The house that I live in is my grandmother's house that we moved into. And I was actually supposed to go to this elementary school before my family moved out of Philadelphia. So during 2013, this elementary, Smith Elementary, closed. And it is now the actual physical space of the building has been converted into rental units, market rate, and then the playground and parking lot are turned into about 12 single-family townhomes that average about $650,000. Um, the house that was my grandmother's house, at this time, it's a two-floor row home, was worth about $150,000 to give you some comparison. And so there has been a lot of development in this area, which brings a lot of young couples that eventually become young families. and there's no school. And so this is happening kind of further east in South Philadelphia, where I am, with a school known as Southwark, which is a K to 8 school. And right across the street is a school known as Bach, which was a high school, a technical high school. My cousin went to Bach. It closed in 2013 and was actually repurposed into a bunch of different things, a maker space, like a kiddie kind of care center and gathering spot, like a mommy and me type of place, a place that sells soccer equipment, a cafe, and at the top, a beautiful restaurant and bar known as Bach Bar. And so this space has attracted a lot of families into the neighborhood, and Southwark, which was never fully utilized, especially during the closures, but was not up for closure, is now overcrowded. And ironically, they lease the gym space from Bach, because they don't have room for all their activities. Now, the deal itself is, the owners who purchase Bach for, $2 or $3 a square foot, lease it to the school district for $1. So it's not an exploitive or extractive agreement, but the fact that the agreement even exists when the district once owned that entire building and property, is sort of the unintended. So, in Overbrook, we see this like population decline and this growth of a school choice industry. And in South Philly, we see a gentrification that's happening as the result of the closure of this like inefficient state good, the redevelopment of it into housing or to new uses, as we saw at Bach, the attraction of a new type of resident and homeowner, and then the kind of slow depopulation as families move away because they don't have school options, in this neighborhood.
Right. That reminds me of, so I'm in Albany, New York, and when I first moved here, they were in the process of closing an underutilized middle school because they were losing students to charters. And then when the charters declined, they suddenly had to scramble to find space to open a new middle school. Um,
Yeah, just very quickly on charters in Philadelphia, they've kind of began in 2001, and we've seen, starting in the 90s, the population or enrollment of the school district was about 200,000 students. Once charter schools come in, we see like a one for one kind of shift. And now in 2024, there's still about 200,000 students, but about 75,000 of them are in charter schools and 125 in traditional public schools. And so, Philadelphia's charter system is eclectic. Some are owned by local nonprofits, some are culturally sensitive, more or less, serving specific constituencies. And some of them are what we call Renaissance charters, which are charters that are actually neighborhood based. So they function essentially as neighborhood schools. They're not allowed to kind of have these citywide application or lottery processes. But we've also seen the decline of those schools and the kind of taking back of those Renaissance charters as traditional public schools.
so this sort of, I almost want to call it a boom bust cycle, but seems, as you said, possibly an inefficient use of public goods. Are there alternatives to closing underutilized schools that would preserve the public infrastructure for public good in a different way?
Sure. And this is actually especially relevant example because it involves public housing as well. So we had a public housing development in North Philadelphia that was demolished and redeveloped, kind of in a Hope Six choice neighborhoods initiative approach. Part of that demolition included the kind of like closure of a local school. And then this school was actually purchased by the housing authority. And so they put a new school in. They hire teachers from the union, so it's effectively operating as a public school, drawing students from the neighborhood. But because the space was still so large, and obviously the population was not utilizing that full space, they started leasing to other nonprofits that had connections to high school. So, a after school program for writers, different job training, different sort of like public goods and services and advocacy groups, all sort of rent space within this. So this sort of and the results have been successful. They've been retaining teachers and students. You're seeing like above average graduation rates and completion rates. So this is, I think, like a success of how to adapt a public school and still sort of keep it a public good. Now, who owns it has obviously shifted from the district to the housing authority, but the fact that it's employing teachers and the teachers union, it's drawing from neighborhood students and providing a benefit. We've seen with Hope Six and other sort of redevelopment initiatives in public housing history that the role of the schools is really critical to securing and retaining the market rate that drives the mixed income logics, right? And so, one of the more successful Hope Six initiatives was in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, where we had this like really robust busing system. So it kind of didn't matter where you lived, everyone took the bus to every school every year. So, people didn't fear the stigma of coming into a place that used to be a public housing community and likely had less quality public goods because they had this sort of like by right choice of any sort of public school. And so I think the example, this is Locke's High School VAUX, is one of a successful readaptation that keeps the physical space public and adjusts to the ebbs and flows of neighborhoods. I mean, communities are going to change over time. We know that. And so it makes sense to adapt the public good in the public space to fit the community needs. And that way you have it, right? You're not having to lease auditorium and gymnasium space from private developers because you sold your public good.
Right. And that is certainly something that could be done by school districts as well without a transfer of ownership.
Certainly. And we saw it during COVID, right? We saw public schools that were closed for educational purposes open to provide vaccines, to provide food, to provide, the pandemic EBT for those who were on free and reduced lunch. So they know how to bring these sort of goods and services to communities that need them. And they choose schools because schools are in every community. They're like a natural infrastructure, but the fact that we have no sort of federal agency overseeing it and, the federal government providing virtually no funding to public schools as it relates to their capital expenditures really sort of just reifies and deepens that dynamic between the public goods or public schools that are good and high property value neighborhoods and those that are not.
What you're describing sounds a lot like the community schools movement to me. That, have they been active at all in Philadelphia? Is there a way to connect that in with this work?
Yeah, we have community schools under our last mayor. Our current mayor, Sherelle Parker, is the first Black woman mayor of the city, is also a former public school teacher, and a parent of a student, has put forward this idea of year-round schools where, there's robust before and after care that sort of mimic the workday of an average parent in Philadelphia, as well as offering robust summer program in coordination with other city departments such as Parks and Recs. I've seen successful incorporation of public libraries into schools. And so, again, the idea of sort of co-locating, I think fits right alongside this idea of the community schools movement. But An earlier initiative with the previous mayor, Mayor Kenny, allocated funding to community schools to do outreach, which was especially effective in our um, sort of high immigrant population neighborhoods where we had a really robust sanctuary schools movement as we are a sanctuary city and sort of organizing to provide both social services, but also sort of like legal protections and care for some very vulnerable communities.
That's wonderful. And so, in contrast to the planning process in 2013 that led to all those school closures, Philadelphia has been working to embark on a different kind of school facilities planning process recently. Can you tell us about how that is going and how it's different from what happened before?
Yeah, so there were definitely lessons learned about the planning process in 2013. And Philadelphia schools were returned to local control in 2017. The School Reform Commission dissolved itself, and now we have a school board that is appointed by our mayor. And so this school board rightfully kind of understood that populations were still continuing to decline, especially towards charter schools, and traditional public schools were underutilized and also in poor condition. So I mentioned, the oldness of the city, but the average age of a school facility in Philadelphia is about 80 years. We have many schools that were built before the 20th century that are still in operation. In addition, we kind of have this century of ill-advised decisions around the materials that we have in our schools. So we have millions of square feet of asbestos, lead in our paint and plaster and our water feeder pipes, mold. Half of our schools lack air conditioning. So the kind of planning process that began in 2019 when it's announced said, you can expect some closures and you can also expect some changes in our catchment areas, which determine based on your address where your local school is. And surprisingly, in 2019, the kind of first reaction to this announcement was not from school organizers or teachers, but from real estate developers. Because at this point, Philadelphia is gentrifying, although we are the kind of largest, poorest city. There are certain areas that are not, as noted by the $650,000 townhomes across the street. And so for the one or two really good K-8 schools in the city, these are highly advertised and signaled in real estate ads. And so the idea that some catchments would be redrawn was a little frightening for the real estate industry. And with this announcement, there was also the idea that there would be kind of a public process. So the consultants from the school district would, form these stakeholder groups by study areas, which were geographic areas containing about 6 to 7 K-8 schools. And they would produce some recommendations that would be presented to the public, adapted by the school board, and implemented in the following year. So it was a pretty traditional planning process. It was also focusing on areas that were very different. So it was focusing on that Overbrook area that I mentioned, where there were very few schools, and many were in bad shape from a facility standpoint and underutilized as a result of the previous closures. There was an area in North Philly that also had a lot of school closures, had a rise in charter school options, but also had a growing sort of immigrant population where new schools were actually being constructed in this area. And then we had a third area in South Philadelphia, pretty close to our downtown, where populations were growing to the point where a new middle school was in discussion. And so we have one area where school closures are pretty imminent because they have a past history and declining population. One area that's growing but is pretty marginalized within the city, and another area that is gentrified and is growing and needs new school options. And so from the start, there was a lot of suspicion, obviously because of the legacy of school closures that had really just happened 6 years before. So if you're a child that their school was closed in second grade, you're in eighth grade now and facing possibly another slate of closure. So this isn't a long time at all. And people were a little upset about how these stakeholder groups were being selected. They were handpicked by principals and not communicated. There were no teachers involved in the planning process. And sort of elected officials and community planners kind of dominated within these stakeholder groups. And so the plan kind of came about to do a few different things, including the opening up of these stakeholder conversations where stakeholders would hold these sort of community and public meetings to provide what they were learning to the public before the mass public meeting. There was this idea of being proactive. So communities that were not included in the first round of this planning process were beginning to already hold meetings and discuss the alternatives so they can prepare for like a counter narrative when it was their turn in the facilities planning process. And then the third group, which was very focused on this idea of working across these study areas. So instead of having this idea of sort of fighting about closures within a constrained geography, thinking about the resources we have across the city and how we can start to reallocate them more effectively. And so, in all those sort of different approaches to planning, there was also this very sort of vocal advocacy and direct action aspect. And so, through this sort of disruption of the school district's planning process, we were able to sort of insert some more participatory, expanding the number of meetings, making these sort of the idea of closure, sort of removing that from the list of recommendations that were provided to stakeholder groups. And so you saw these sort of different levels of intervention.
And when you say we, tell me a little bit more about who was involved in organizing to push back and change this planning process.
Sure. So, as a result of both the state takeover of the school board in 2001 and the closures of 2013, there was actually sort of a robust educational justice organizing infrastructure within Philadelphia. So you have groups that are very focused on bringing back sort of like progressive organizers and politics into the city. You have this like citywide coalition, Our City, Our Schools, which is a bunch of different community organizations, parent groups, and student groups that organize in some way around educational justice. You have, like I say, these very sort of active parent groups as well as these sort of parent school groups. So each school in Philadelphia has a home and school association, which is our PTA, as well as a school advisory committee or SAC, which is parents and community members and business owners. And so a lot of those groups also came into organizing these broader public conversations as a way to sort of redistribute some of the power and knowledge of the planning process so that communities wouldn't be sort of the last to know about what was happening, what options were on the table.
This all sounds, fairly similar to a lot of things that housing and community development groups get involved in and wanting to have more neighborhood input in a planning process. Were there any organizations of that sort that have gotten involved in this process?
Yeah, within our city, our schools in particular, there are a lot of like community groups. There are groups that are full of like sort of homeowners and property owners. There are groups that are for specific constituencies within the city. We have a pretty robust Philadelphia Student Union as well. And teachers were also sort of involved. So our teachers union, particularly a more progressive wing of the union known as the Working Educators Caucus, were all sort of involved. But community, like quality of life, was really kind of centered in these discussions. I'm thinking about a group in the sort of North Philadelphia, the high immigrant population area that I mentioned earlier. They were really concerned about school closures translating into gentrification. I felt like that was one of the most sort of striking takeaways during these sort of different meetings across the city was that people could draw like a really straight line between a school closure and the construction of $400,000 townhomes in areas where that was not the median home value. So they saw this as just kind of a further sort of coalition or a growth machine that's emerging between downtown and the school district. And so that was really a primary concern. You also saw concerns about segregation. And so there were parents, particularly in the growing neighborhood near the downtown, who, didn't like that there was a big sort of racial divide across one street in Philadelphia and said, okay, we're going to get a middle school. We're going to build a middle school. Can we like draw that catchment for the middle school across this racial divide so that we can have like an integrated school and kind of set that tone? And so these were kind of discussions, in the absence of the real estate industry that didn't want redrawn catchments. That was really thinking about, okay, we have a lot of power in this conversation. How can we like set a model for something that like reflects like communities' needs. So
That's really great. And it seems like, community development organizations that are building affordable housing or doing community planning would make a lot of sense to be in those conversations. And if a school has to be closed, maybe it could be affordable housing at the least, right? Uh,
right.
but so from looking at that experience, do you have suggestions for housing focused community groups and how they could support their schools or equitable school planning overall and in other places, particularly if there isn't quite this planning process laid out for them to step into?
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing when thinking about affordable housing or housing developers in public schools is that you really need to engage with the school as it is currently. You can't think like, okay, we're bringing in this housing. What's like the ideal school that needs to be here? And it has a certain type of programming or a certain, magnet that's going to attract from across the city and, fulfill your bottom line, which is to fill the housing units, right? If we know that connection between school quality and housing. But just thinking about, okay, this school may be empty, but it's serving as a pre-K center, it's serving as an after-school center, it's serving as job training, it's serving as a cooling center, it's serving, as a community gathering space. Like think about that when you're thinking about what you can bring to the school and what value that school is adding for your residents and for your communities. And so I think the the main goal, the main takeaway is kind of like starting to separate this sort of very subjective idea of school quality as a way to drive home values and thinking about the sort of actually existing role the school plays and how to strengthen that role for that community.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also strikes me that they could maybe step into a conversation about school closure with some of those ideas you were talking about earlier about other uses, being an organization that might be able to provide some of those other uses and therefore support a different model for that school going forward.
Yeah, the co-location is, I think, so critical. And it's funny because one of the people who works at the housing authority actually worked at the school district during the closures, and I think took a lot of those lessons from the school district, and could be kind of key he would never admit this, but could be kind of key to why it's so successful now. Because it was like that thoughtfulness, of like, this is not just an asset to monetize and sell off to fulfill our bottom line in terms of the public school or the school district, but this is a key public good, and we really want to one of the hardest things is sort of breaking through to people who have no skin in the game of the public school, right? And so you really have to kind of sell it as like, these are your tax dollars, like this is what your tax dollars is going to support. These are your schools. You should have a voice. You should have some input into it. And you shouldn't see a school closure as something that improves your property value. You should think about how can you improve the school and your property value at the same time. People, as I say, like, don't like get upset when you close a public school. But they would get upset if you closed a public park, And so you have to kind of think about them in the same way as like, you may not directly engage with it, but you know that it serves a broader good, and anchors your community. So that's really what the work is trying to get across at this point.
I think that's a wonderful place to conclude. A
Cool.
great ending message. But if there's anything else that you didn't get to say that you want to add in here, please
Great
do.
stuff.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah, it's super helpful.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Um,
Awesome.
yeah.